All right. So when I tell you that this is a map, that shouldn't be a surprise to most people, right? Like this looks like a map. You're kind of used to what this looks like. There's some roads, there's some colors that kind of imply that there's difference in this thing that we think of as the landmass and sort of the water. And there's little round things with words. And we kind of get the sense that there's like stuff happening on this map that's going to be useful. Well, what about this? Does this look like a map to anybody? Um, you can either drop a comment in the chat or something like that, but this is a map as well. It's not of the Earth, it's of the stars, and it's actually used so that the Apollo 11 astronauts could navigate on the not the geography, because it's not geo, but the lunar surface. So what this is sort of a navigational wayfinding aid that uses star charts, much like ancient human ancestors did to navigate, because what we're looking at is a new view of something that allows us to kind of determine our course and our heading and figure out where we're going. But maps don't have to be of traditional things either. What we're looking at here is the map of the fictional world of Faerun, which is kind of the Dungeons and Dragons kind of homeland. But it looks very similar to that map of North America that I showed a minute ago, right? We have like some things that imply connections between circular things that are kind of representing some form of you know, city or something like that. And what we're seeing is we're seeing like geographic aspects, we're seeing colors that are differentiating parts of this world between rivers and roads and ocean or sea. And then we have text kind of giving us labels on what we're looking at. So we have like geographic features like forests, as well as rivers and cities or towns or something like that. So this is a map too, but we're not talking about anything that actually exists. This is all just sort of like an imaginary place that we're thinking of, that we're representing geographically through a map, because the way we think of geography and space often is portrayed through this sort of bird's eye in the sky view, looking down onto the earth and showing up or showing these types of geographic features. But that's not the only way maps exist. I already showed you the star chart, which is a navigational aid, and it's a map of the stars. But what about this? Well, as a bit of a spoiler, this is a map, and the title of this work is Map of Winona County, Minnesota. And what's interesting is that you see this geographic landscape, but you don't have sort of like presentation of roads, or you don't have geographic features or anything like that. What you have is you have like a person standing on a hill or a really tall tree, kind of showing what the city looks like in Winona, Minnesota in 1866. And so what you could do is you could probably use like the central steeple in the middle of town to kind of navigate if you're kind of going to where this train is over to the right. It's probably a train station or a factory over here, because we got big smokestacks or something, so that generally what you're going to do is you're going to keep the river on your right and the church steeple on your left, and then you kind of go until you reach the factory. And so that's kind of a wayfinding aid, and that's a way to do that. But it doesn't look like the way we think of, right? But that's still a map. Because the creator called it a map, but also it's a way to present geographic features like the hills that surround it, and this town, and the river that kind of runs by this town, and sort of this road down here to the bottom left that you can see. There's geographic features, and there's cities, and there's no text really that's kind of outlining what parts of the town this is. But this is part of a map as well, right? What about these? Little spoiler again, that the lines that you're seeing are connecting real life, or not real life, I'm sorry, but geographic mapped features on these, this like blue, green, white, and brown map to bits of carved driftwood. And what this is it's a tactile map, and these are carved pieces of driftwood that were used by an Inuit tribe in Greenland that they would keep these little pieces of driftwood in their mittens as they were paddling their canoes and things through the fjords of Greenland. And what they would do is they would be able to keep their mittens on while they're paddling and kind of feel whether or not they passed 3 bumps of outcroppings before they get to the fjord that they're actually looking at. And what you would do is you would sort of just like go down one side, around, and then down the other side. And then that you would map how far you needed to go to get to your trading post or to your neighbor's village or something like that. And so these are maps as well, but there's not scale. There's not, like labels. There's not a compass heading to kind of know which way north is or anything like that, but it's still directional, it's still representational, and it still has land features on it that kind of show someone who is familiar with reading this type of information presented physically or tactilely. It's a way to look at the earth or the globe or the land in a way that lets you navigate correctly. And so this is just a base, these pieces of carved driftwood are basically just a way to think about what would maps look like if you've never seen a map before. And that's what I'm hoping to get to today. These also, I'm going to kind of leave these up here and talk about them a little bit, but I'm not going to tell you exactly what they are. But we have a C chart on the left, or we have this artistic representation down, on the right. And what you're looking at here is 2 representations of, again, features that help with navigation. And be thinking to yourself what these might be representing. On the left, what we have is a sea chart that Marshallese Islanders were using in the early 19th, from the 19th to the early 20th century. And what this is representing is these 2 seashells on the left and the right, the farthest left and farthest right are islands. And what's actually being represented by these curved pieces of plant matter is the way waves break around islands. And so what you're doing is you're not looking at geographic features of like the seafloor or anything, but what you're doing is you're looking at the way the ever-changing sea, like you can't point to a piece of the ocean and say like, this is exactly where this comes from, or this is exactly where this is. But what you're doing is you're saying like, hey, look, generally the currents are going to curve this way because they're being broken up by a set of islands or something like that. And so what you can do is you can sort of look and see if you see this intersection, a particular intersection kind of in the middle where you see 2 curved inwards and 2 curved outwards, you kind of know if you can point yourself in the right direction, you can see where an island is, which helps with navigation between really, really distant islands. Now, these wouldn't be maps that the Marshallese Islanders would take with them, but what they do is they're basically flashcards. So the Marshallese Islanders, the navigators, on these great cross-Pacific boat voyages, these navigators would spend lots and lots of time learning from these to understand the shapes of the tides and the current and things like that while they were on dry land so that they could recognize them out on the water. But it's still this mental model of looking at the world and understanding what it looks like to know when or to know how to navigate through things. The one on the right is a little bit different. This is not a map. And I want to be really careful. This is not a direction either. What this is an artistic representation of sort of Australian Aboriginal creation stories about the sort of creation of bits of the natural landscape in Australia and sort of like outback Australia. And what this is it's a representation of the dream time. And the dream time is sort of this sacred Australian Aboriginal story about the creation of the world. And for those that are allowed to kind of know this ancestral wisdom, there is this representation of the world that is called to mind and called into being by singing a song or telling this story about the dream time that discusses walking through the outback and sort of passing trees and passing rocks and passing rivers. And what this is doing is sort of calling into mind a journey during the dream time. And so it's really important that for Australian Aboriginal communities to not graphically represent that, because it's sacred. There are spirits in the land and the rocks in the ocean and the trees and things like this that shouldn't be trapped by portraying them static and in a map. So what you do is you pass this knowledge down orally, but this art on the right is sort of a representation to potentially help transmit this oral culture, this navigational aid that is kind of spoken of or sung. But it's sort of like a visual reminder of like the way the story works, so that someone who does know the story and the directions and sort of like the lay of the land, they can communicate that to other people. But this is not the thing that you would carry with you to like go from one place to another. It's just sort of this portrayal of the land. Since the land is sacred, you want to respect the fact that the land can only be described through song or through voice. You don't represent it through this map. You just sort of gesture at the knowledge that is already passed down. Much in the same way that the Marshallese sea chart on the left, you don't represent something like waves, because the waves are always changing, they're never in the same place. But what you can do is you can represent what the general idea of the currents looks like. And while we might be thinking of that a little bit weird, I'm sorry, or what we might be thinking of is that like, oh, okay, well, but that's not what we think of in, usually European or North American contexts for maps. I'd ask you to think about what a map really includes, right? So like the Oxford English Dictionary says that there are constituent parts of a map, which is a representation of the Earth's surface on a flat surface, right? So like the Earth is round, it's a globe. We have to represent that in some way that makes it flat, because otherwise it's not a map, it's a globe. If you show the distribution of physical or geographic features, and it has like these points of representation in some form of uniformity, so like scale or projection or something like that, what you're doing is you're presenting an abstraction from the real world. And the reason you think about, the reason we talk about it this way is because if you make a map that has every single geographic feature and every minute detail, like every tiny pebble and tiny rock, you're making a map of the world the size of the world. So you have to get rid of some details. And so some of this you represent abstractly, or you represent it in a way that's sort of like representational, not completely true. And what we think of is, thinking back to that fire dreaming, it's still a representation. It's still a representation of a round Earth surface on a flat medium, but it's being representational. It's being really abstract, because the point is that knowledge is understood by someone who can interpret it. And so the reason the reason I like to talk about maps this way is getting to this idea of why we should think about mapping in the first place, right? So like if you have data and you're wanting to represent your data somehow, or you have a concept or an idea that you want to show that relates in some way to a space, a physical space, you want to visualize that, right? You want to give information visually through some form of color or line or shape or something like that. And what you can use is you can use mapping to imply the geographic nature of that data while saving some things like color and line and shape and shading or something like that for the aspects of the data itself. So that lets you sort of look at and present patterns or movements or relationships between different things that may have a geographic component in it. It also allows you contextualize those things. So, right, if you have like two neighborhoods one of which is very wealthy and one of which is very poor or something like that, you can show that there is a divide between those based on something, right? So you can provide context if it's a geographical barrier. So like the whole idea of like the sort of disparaging comment about like the other side of the tracks. Oftentimes in the US at least, this is on two different sides of railroad tracks. There's sort of like the economically um, uh, like prosperous part of town or wealthy part of town that's on the sort of residential side of some form of infrastructure, and then the other side, which is often run down through various different socioeconomic policies or things like that. There is a dividing line there between those two communities that happens to be based on the presence of train tracks. And so geographically, you can show that. You can sort of show where the train track goes, and then you can show the sort of various aspects that you might be wanting to represent there, like median household income or food desert status or access to fresh fruit or something like that. And so it allows you to kind of show that on a map because the geographic nature of what you're talking about is implied, and it's sort of the base level rather than showing that on like a bar chart or something, or a line graph or something like that, where the geographic nature isn't being presented visually while you can still present some of these other features. So, as we're talking about all of this, right, as we talk through the rest of today, what I'm going to be focusing on is the artistic and sort of graphical elements of mapping and sort of data visualization. And I have this quote down here by Alberto Queiro, who's a great data visualization scholar and kind of looks, he's a data journalist as well. And he just has this quote, which I think is great, that the first and main goal of any graphic and visualization is to be a tool for your eyes and brain to perceive what lies beyond their natural reach, right? So I can't see the entirety of North America, and I don't understand necessarily where the Rocky Mountains are in comparison to like the Florida Keys or something like that. But a visualization can show me the relative distance and the relative direction of those things. And then when I start using more complex graphical visualizations, I can start to look at things like the extent of population between Alaska and Florida or something like that. So like I'm adding information that my eyes and brain can then perceive and analyze through some form of graphic and visual representation. But when we think about this, I'm sure as you've kind of worked through data concepts and things like that, there's always ways to manipulate data, and there's always data that you can't use, and there's always data that's going to be left out or suppressed or highlighted. And that goes with maps too, right? So like if you have a one map and you showed me that map and I said, oh, well, why don't you kind of change the font or like move the labels for towns to the opposite side of the dot or something like that, that's still using the same data. So you can make a million different types of maps from the same set of data. And there's a bunch of different choices that you can make by what you choose to suppress, what you choose to emphasize, how you represent certain things. And so Kelly will talk about in the future workshop about, are you lying with your map, right? Like, are you presenting the data in your map in a way that's both fair and representational of the actual data that you're using, and B, like, are you insinuating something, or are you trying to make a claim or not trying to make a claim that your map actually is showing? And just know that whenever you look at a map, these decisions are being made behind the scenes before you get the chance to look at it. So there's a lot of things that are happening with maps that you should still use your critical eye and your sort of like best judgment to understand whether or not this is good information or valid data, even when you look at a map. So we're going to just jet through some interesting history of maps to kind of get you thinking about what can a map be. And so what I want to start with is one of the earliest maps that I think is known. And it's this idea that there is a centrality and there are representations of things within the world, and then there is a border to the world. So this is a Babylonian map from circa 700 to 500 BCE. So this is, 2,500 years old potentially, but it's a map of the world. And so we have this idea that in the center, this little dot in the center was just sort of a way to get a compass to inscribe like concentric circles. But what we have is the center of the known universe, which is the Euphrates River. So this kind of like bent straight line that's kind of coming from the 1130 on the clock up on the top center left-ish, coming down. That is the Euphrates River, currently in Iraq, but sort of like the center of the Mesopotamian Empire. And then we have this idea that there is a city, kind of, you can see the labels over here, that is somewhere else, because Babylon, the main city, the main city of the Babylonian Empire, is a city that spans across both sides of the Euphrates, or the Euphrates divides the city of Babylon. And then all circling this is we have the world ocean. So once you get to the Mediterranean Sea, or even maybe even the Atlantic Ocean, you have this idea that the world ends and it's either nothing but ocean, or this concept that like the ocean is the thing in which the world rests. So some ancient cosmography for you there, but this idea that there is a center, there is a periphery, and there are ways to represent large, like how many buildings did Babylon have? Well, it doesn't really matter, because what we're doing is we're showing this just as a little rectangle. How curvy and how changing was the Euphrates River doesn't really matter. What we have is we sort of have this straight line that's a representational and abstracted form of this like really, really important thing that's happening in the Babylonian Empire. But we move that to something like this, where we start to recognize a map that we would probably see today, but we still see that there's some like differences in the way we're thinking about presentation. So we have something that looks like, we have a projection here that we sort of see like some expanding lines. We see sort of like curvature. And so this is a copy of Ptolemy's Geographia, so like the description of the known world. And you see like the coasts of Italy here, and you see sort of like the Iberian Peninsula over here and the Strait of Gibraltar, and then you see Africa, which is just large and unknown to explorers and geographers in Constantinople circa 1300, right? So we're in the medieval period, we're at sort of the early height of the Byzantine Empire and like early Ottoman empires of like the vast scientific knowledge that kind of comes out of a lot of the Islamic Eastern world at that point. But what we have is we have these rivers that are sort of like squiggly straight lines, like we have the Nile, which doesn't even, okay, so the Nile is like pretty well represented sort of down here to the bottom right, but then we have like these Central European rivers that are really funny looking, right? Like we have the Seine River kind of like going through Paris in the center here. But like we have some really funny squiggly looking rivers that are like, yeah, I don't know, it kind of starts up here and then kind of ends around here in the Alps. So just really funny representations of stuff, but it's really close to what we think of now. And you could recognize this, I would hope, if you've kind of seen maps of Western Europe. Western Europe looks like Western Europe, but Africa does not look like how we know of Africa today. And partially that's just because it's representing the known knowns of the Mediterranean, which is sort of the center of the world in a lot of Mediterranean cultures, from like the ancient Egyptians through the Fertile Crescent all the way up to the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. What about this one? Anybody have any guesses as to what this might be representing? And you feel free to drop answers in the chat, and I'll kind of take a look at them in a second. This is a different way of portraying the world. And so what this is doing is actually representing kind of the same area. So what we're looking at both in the detail and sort of in that like bottom center portion of the map on the left. The map on the left is a full map, and then the right is just sort of a detail of that center area. But what we're looking at here is we're looking at the Mediterranean with a really funny look in Italy, this little horn over here. I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but this little horn sort of in the bottom left of the detail, that's Italy. And then up at the top here in the center, this little gear looking thing in the detail, but sort of right smack dab in the middle of the main map, that's Jerusalem. And what this is it's produced around the same time period, right? So like 14th century, 1300s. And what we're looking at is the known world according to Christian, Western European Christians. And so what this is sort of understanding that there's still this round circular ocean that's the border of the world, but the center of the universe, the center of the world is the place that, like the life story of Jesus happened. For Christians, that is the holy city of Jerusalem. And this is 1300, so this is post at least 2, potentially 3, depending on when it was happening, crusades to get to the Holy Land, get to Jerusalem. And so it makes sense that what's happening is that this is a center, a Jerusalem-centered map, because what the idea is that the world is ordered such that north and south don't matter, it's center and periphery. And so we see Jerusalem here in the center, and then what we actually have is upwards on this map, so sort of like directly what we would think of as north, that's actually east, that's Asia. And then the bottom left, so like southwest, is actually northwest Europe, and on the right is Africa. So the Mediterranean is sort of right here in the center, facing or kind of pointing downwards. So if you think about this map and then rotate it 90 degrees to your right, that's how we would normally think of. So north on this map is actually to the left. If there's a clock, it would be at 9 o'clock. And so it's just this idea that what we think of as standard, north is up, and the center of the world is generally kind of like the mid-Atlantic. That's not what Christians in the medieval period were thinking, because what was interesting to them was to get to the center of the universe, which was for them, because of their Christian faith, Jerusalem. So same idea as thinking about that Babylonian map, the center of the world is their city. They are the entire known, like the center of the entire known universe, known world. So everything should radiate out from that. So just be thinking, like there's all these fun little details of like various castles and forts and things like that the Crusaders have probably run into and things like that. But the center of this is Jerusalem. Europe is the bottom left, and Africa is the bottom right, and everything that's kind of in that center is related to the Mediterranean, because it's easy to sail a ship across the Mediterranean. It takes a really, really long time to kind of walk through Eastern Europe and the steppes of Asia and things like that. But what I also wanted to show is this, which is probably the oldest map that I've ever seen. This isn't a map of the world. This is something different. And it's probably from the 12th century BCE in the New Kingdom of Egypt. And it's a map of a quarry. So we're not talking about like the entire world here. This isn't the entire known world. This is like a map of some stone mining that was happening. And so Pharaoh Ramses IV is looking at trying to document where marble has been cut or stone has been cut out of his quarry, so that he knows what's already been gathered and what hasn't been gathered, so he can send people where they need to go to get more stuff. And so this is just sort of like a documentation of what we would think of really small scale of like, so I'm in Strozier Library right now. There are maps of the books in our building that you don't need to represent the entirety of the universe or the entirety of the world. All you need to know is that that book that I'm looking for is up on the 4th floor and it's kind of in this general area. That's what this map is representing. It's something hyper local, but still really important. So you can use maps to kind of do whatever you need to. And this is something that I think was probably really familiar to all of us. You know, you give back in the days before Google Maps, I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember this, but you kind of like sketch out your neighborhood to tell your friends how to get to you. But you draw it on like a post-it note or a napkin or something like that. So this is that same idea of just something really small, something really local that you still need to find direction. You need to find how to get to a place and then do some form of data or like add some form of data to that map. And basically it's whether or not the rock is good there and whether or not you already kind of mined it. So really, really old map. We've been using maps as a species for a really, really long time to try and help us navigate and find our way and our place in the world to do things. So similar to this one, can anybody give me a guess as to what this is? And again, we have a kind of flipped from last time. The bottom, the thing in the bottom right in the little white box, that's the full extent of what we're looking at. Or the full extent of the map. And then the thing that I'm showing you is the little bit in red. And I'll give you a hint. It's also European generally, but can anybody give me a guess as to what that is? Go ahead and drop it in the chat. All right, so we got a couple guesses here. Kelly got it right. This is Rome in the center. And what we're actually looking at is the Tyrrhenian and the Adriatic seas around the peninsula of Italy. And what we're looking at is the extent of coasts, but really the important part is these orange lines. And these orange, probably red originally, lines are Roman roads. And so this is a later copy, a 13th century Roman, I'm sorry, 13th century medieval copy of a potential 4th to 5th century CE original of the extent of the Roman Empire and all of the roads that crossed the Roman Empire so that you can use this like Google Maps. If you know you need to get from Rome to a place in Far East Asia or as far east as the Roman Empire went, what you do is you just sort of plan your route out by tracing your finger along these little red lines, and you can see where forts and towns are as you go along, and you can sort of tell, okay, I need to take the first right, and then I need to kind of go through 4 towns, and then I'll take a left, and then another town, and then just kind of keep going until I get to, I don't know, somewhere way far east in the Roman Empire. Or west, right? Like the little, what's kind of funny is that you'll get up into this bit on the massive map over here, all the way to the left, you sort of see that little bit kind of hanging out in the middle, floating like a little amoeba up here. That's Ireland. So how to get to Ireland is go really far and then hop over some water and then hop over some water again. So just funny to think about, like what this is basically like a really, really old Rand McNally road atlas. So you kind of just check which highways you need to go to and what towns you can stop for the night to get your horse some feed or cars, get some gas or something like that, and get some snacks so you can keep going on your road trip. And then for those of you in Tallahassee, we also have some fun maps that are not what we would think of, but this is still sort of abstracted, and it's sort of thinking about navigation and sort of general sense of what we're looking at rather than direction. So this is an early map of Tallahassee, late 19th century. And what we're looking at is not necessarily how to get around, but sort of key landmarks and geographic features. So we're looking at like, okay, how do I get from a courthouse downtown to campus? Well, what I do is I kind of like go down this one hill, generally to the east, but this isn't being presented as north is to the top. And it's really not being presented as a way to look at directions by kind of, following a map exactly. It's still just a gist. It's kind of like a representational aspect of what town looks like, as if it were you flying in a hot air balloon or something like that, kind of taking in the panoramic view of Tallahassee. So interesting stuff. All right, moving on a little bit. I had talked a little bit about how we think about representing data on our maps. And I've kind of talked a little bit about the different ways that one can represent maps and sort of how they don't have to be north is always to the top, the center is always in the Atlantic Ocean, land is always green or brown, and ocean is blue. But how do we get into a little bit more complex thinking about what we can do with maps? And what I want to start with is I want to start us thinking about more abstraction, right? So geospatial, we're talking about geospatial data. We're talking about maps. We're talking about geography and things like that. And the reason I bring this up is because it comes from some Greek roots, meaning, we're already emphasizing that this is happening on the earth. And we've already looked at some examples that this is maybe not exactly on the earth. Maybe this is in a fictional country or a fictional world, or maybe this is in the stars or the cosmos or something like that. So it doesn't have to be an actual bird's eye view of land features on our planet Earth. But we're doing something to represent a spatial context. So we're giving, the sky, the night sky from the moon as the base context of where we're going to be giving directions or mapping constellations, or we're giving some form of context to the Dungeons and Dragons world so that we know generally kind of where our adventuring party is headed off to or something like that. But we're thinking about this in a spatial context, or else we wouldn't really be using a map. What we're doing is we're talking about the extent of something, how wide it went, how far an event took, or some like phenomenon happened. Or we're talking about the space between two things, right? So like two different cities, if we're showing how far they are and how long a journey takes to get there, we have to show what we're doing is using a map and geographic distance to show distance, farness, I guess. But what we're doing there is what we should be thinking about doing is how to do that by presenting some form of data. So we have to have measured something. We have to have, created data, measured or captured something. And then how we represent that in this physical context is how we get some geospatial data. And so as you start thinking through the next couple of workshops, how to represent stuff in the various programs like ArcGIS or QGIS or even Google Maps or something like that, be thinking in sort of these broad contexts of like, what is the captured thing, data that I'm trying to represent spatially with concessions to like how far it is between two things. So just be thinking about that. And then I also want you to be thinking about why are you visualizing it? So I kind of gave that quote in the beginning to kind of get you to think about what is the purpose of us visualizing things? Well, hopefully it's to make it more understandable or provide richer context for the thing that we're trying to argue or display. But if we do that, we also have to be cognizant of the fact that there are some things that people are really good at interpreting visually, and there's some things that people are not as good at, right? So in the drastic example of this is if you start graphing the difference between things in reds and greens, and someone with red-green color blindness looks at your map and just sort of sees a wash of gray, that's not doing a really good job of representing the difference between things. But that's a drastic example. There are some things that people are really bad at doing or sort of differently good at doing, even just from person to person, right? So like if you give the area of a circle to two different people, visually you kind of portray that and it's different by like a very small amount, it's going to be very difficult to see the difference between those unless they're exactly side by side in a lot of really, really close comparative things. So like the same color, the same shade on the same type of background and stuff like that. So a lot of these like bubble charts that you see where like populations of cities are represented by like how big of a circle is around the dot that centers the city. It's really difficult if you have two cities that are in close, are like close in population that are distanced by like a really long visual distance, because that makes it really difficult to kind of compare whether or not they're close or if they're sort of like, a quarter off from each other or something like that. So be thinking about that, but also use visualization to help you, right? Like I could give you this list on the left of various different categories of things. So this is a graph that I've done previously in some of my own work, thinking about a handful of British manorial estates and their incomes and their expenses. And if I just kind of throw the names of the manor and the category and the year that it's happening with a total, it gets really difficult to kind of look at this data in like a long time, or it gets difficult to look at this for a long time and really make sense out of it. But if I present you these graphs on the right, you can sort of see there are more expenses than there are receipts. So like more expenses than income. And you can sort of see where the difference is and how drastic that difference is. But you also see like over a span of years, I can show you timelines for that. So I can show you over the course of these, 200 years almost, or almost exactly 200 years, you can see like how this changes for certain places and not for others. So it's easier to glance at the thing on the right, but when you look at the chart on the left, you really have to parse it. You have to understand it a little bit more. So it's really difficult to do that. But what I've just done there is I've shown you a category, a handful of categories of data that I've already done some form of analysis on. I've already decided what everything that is an expense and everything that is a receipt. But what I haven't done is I haven't shown you how the sausage gets made for that data collection or things like that. So this visualization is really interesting because it comes from a project called the Dear Data Project. And it's two graphic artists that sent each other a year's worth, so 52 postcards, a year's worth of postcards, one a week, where they measured various different things. And what's happening on the right, based on this key to the bottom left, is that there are 24 hours in a day. The artist tracked when they did various tasks. So when they looked at clocks in various different capacities. So in their car, on their watch, or on their phone, or something like that. And then graphed that about when the day happened. I'm sorry, where in the day it happened. And there are 7 lines on each one. So where in the week that happened. So it's really pretty. It's really interesting. But you're de-emphasizing the fact that, a lot of these, you can start to see patterns, but you're sort of de-emphasizing the days of the week. And you're just kind of emphasizing the fact that there are a lot of times that the artist looked at their phone to check the time, which is just this sort of V pattern with no like other emphasis, it's just sort of the plain lines. That seems to be the most, and you can sort of see when that happened the most on which day. So that's kind of an interesting way to show that, but it's really difficult to parse that and really understand. You have to sit there for a while, especially sort of in this, the Monday morning or the Monday times, right? It's really difficult in the center here to kind of see what's happening because there's a lot of overlapping lines. But it's art, it's not necessarily data. Otherwise, you could just say like, I checked my clock 5 times on Monday, but you're visualizing it. You're kind of emphasizing the fact that it happened a lot, which is one of the key points here. So this is from W.E.B. Du Bois, a great sociologist, doing a study on the sort of economic agency of recently freed African Americans right after the Civil War. And so this history of various different things for a data visualization conference, basically, in Paris, sort of in the mid 19th century, mid to late 19th century, around 1869, I believe. But what was happening is this graph shows the population of free African Americans versus enslaved African Americans. And you're looking and it's telling a story, like colors here tell a story about the monolithic numbers of how many African Americans were enslaved for these years. And it's just this giant black visual monolith on this graph that is slowly being overtaken in the present, sort of on this timeline, by green, which represents freedom in this one. So it's the emphasis here. Oops, sorry. The emphasis here is on the massive amount of enslaved people that make up this population for so long, up until recently, and then the drastic change after the Emancipation Proclamation. So it tells a story, it allows us to visualize and de-emphasize and make pretty art and things like that, but it also allows us to do investigations. So this is a really famous map by a British doctor named John Snow, who was investigating the an outbreak of cholera while they were trying to figure out, while Dr. Snow was trying to figure out how cholera was spreading in this neighborhood in Paris. And so cholera, for those that don't know, we know now is a disease often spread by tainted water. And so there's usually some form of like, usually like fecal matter in a water supply. But at the time, this was discovered by Dr. Snow and a team of other scientists and doctors, because what this map shows is it shows little hash marks, tick marks, for all of the locations where an outbreak of cholera is represented. But this Broad Street, this map shows that Broad Street is sort of where it was happening the most. And if you see sort of to the northwest, or well, to the north, I guess, to the upper left of where that pump is, sort of in that center where there's like a large amount of tick marks, is a workhouse. And so it was believed that cholera was spread before this investigation. It was believed that cholera was spread from poor person to poor person and could not be contracted by wealthy people, except there weren't that many occurrences in this workhouse, but there were a lot in these areas sort of just on the one side of Broad Street, which was predominantly wealthy. And so what's happening is it was found that the water supply was to blame. And so that's why there's these marks for the pumps. And so it turned out that this one pump was tainted by something. And that's why the disease is spreading, not because these rich people were like having to walk by poor people too often or something like that. So it's an investigative method, and you can use maps to do investigations in the same way today. Talked about some uses of maps. We talked about historical maps and sort of ways that we can think about doing non-standard maps. But what I want to quickly go through is some elements and principles of design. And I've talked about this before, thinking about the amount of space that a visual takes up. So that W.E.B. Du Bois visualization, where there's a large amount of black on the screen or on the visualization, which takes up a lot of visual space because black seems to like draw the eye in and things like that. But what's important to think about is not just the fact that you need to make a map, is that the design choices that you make are influencing how people are going to see and interpret and understand your work too. So this is thinking about sort of introductory art elements and things like that. But what we're thinking about is these concepts of things like line, value, color, texture, shape, size, and direction, and how those are applied. Are they being applied in ways that seem uniform? Are they in conflict with each other, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And what we're thinking about there is how people's eyes and their brains interpret elements of the visual aspects of what we're talking about in ways that either imply or are meant to pass along other information. So what you can see there is this word that we would most likely be able to read okay as Gestalt. And it's a German word, but the idea is that none of these shapes that you're seeing in the GESTALT are actually those letters in the way that you might normally think. But our brain is used to seeing letter forms and have put them together into this idea of this concept of a word. And we may not necessarily know what that word means, but we can read it. We understand that it's a thing because we've seen, we've grown up seeing these letters, if you sort of grew up with English as your first language and you're used to using this style of alphabet. And so what's happening is that like there are cultural suppositions and there's cultural norms that are taken advantage of and used in artistic design to imply meaning. And so I can write this letter G, but leave out a giant chunk of it in the middle. And I can assume that you as a reader, if you share the same cultural background as me, or in the same sorts of cultural backgrounds as me, I can assume that you're going to understand that we will share meaning on this letter that is a G. And so when you represent things on maps in certain ways, you may be assuming that your audience is going to be able to understand it the same way you do, but that may not necessarily be the case. So just be thinking about that. All right, now getting into mapping, right? So a lot of high-minded, heady stuff. But what we're thinking about here is how we can apply all of that to maps. And Kelly's going to get into a lot of this later in some of our other workshops. But what we're thinking about is types of maps. And so there's two main types of maps. There's this idea of the reference map, where it shows geographic space and it kind of shows you what's going on, and sort of like the space around where you're looking. Or there are thematic maps where you use the geographic space to talk about something else. So here we're looking at plant hardiness zones. So we're using the geographic space of the US and Puerto Rico to show where plants can grow and like the types of plants that will grow in that area. The actual geographic borders of like the states aren't really important for the plants, which is why the colors sort of like cross between state lines and things like that. But it helps people who live in the US who kind of understand where they live. If they've looked at maps like this before, they can kind of tell what plants would live in their zone. So you sort of use the map as like a placeholder so that people can understand exactly where they're kind of from. And then they can use other data to like increase the knowledge of whatever they're talking about using the map as like a base level. So as we've been talking about, maps come in many different shapes, many different sizes, and can look like things that might not necessarily be maps. So this is sort of the standard accepted list of things that a map must have in order to be a map: title, orientation, symbols, legend or key, scale, and grid reference, right? So here on this example map, we actually don't have a title, but it's presented without a title because it's part of a larger series. But we have this grid reference that tells us the latitude and longitude coordinates. We have an orientation, so we know north is up here. We have a scale for how far things are. We have a legend and key. We actually don't have a legend and key in here, but what we would see is basically like this little dotted line equals a major road. These red ones are sort of like trails or paths. Sorry, not trails. Like B roads or something like that. A circle with white in it is a major city, and then black circles are just like smaller cities. So that's some sort of information that we would expect from a map. But what we've looked at already is these other things are also maps. So the important things from Marc Monnier, who's a really brilliant scholar who's like talked about maps for a really long time. What makes a map is scale, projection, and symbolization. All of the other things are just ways of representing these three concepts. And when you use GIS, what you're doing is you're taking those ideas and you're interpreting them in ways that a computer can understand and represent. So represent, but also like the computer is fed information and then it represents those things. So you have this idea of the real world that gets extracted and abstracted into this idea of raster, which is categories of types of data that have sort of a grid reference to it, and then a vector, which is sort of the extent of where these things are. And the vector is sort of like shapes and lines and things like that and points, whereas raster representation is more qualitative. It's the sort of stuff that a thing is. So we got river, we got pines, we got spruces, and then we got a house. And all of these things could be represented by the overlaying of raster and vector so that you get something like this, right? So this is a map of the UK, but with vector and raster data that outlines roads and cities and extent of travel time in this pink and cream color for either 2 or 3 days um, during the medieval and Roman periods. So you kind of represent all of this, and the geographic base layer is kind of showing you how tall or difficult it is to get to places. But you have these visual representations of things like roads and cities and towns. And then you can get really complicated with these. You kind of show some overlapping things where you use county level data in this map to overlay multiple different aspects of other data. So food insecurity and obesity rate represented through colors to show what spaces in the US have rates of low or high food insecurity and then low or high obesity. So you can kind of use this to graph and also investigate some of those things. I know we're basically at time, so I'm going to skip through some of these. But as we think about abstractions, like what we're talking about here, there's an abstraction for like a color based on food insecurity and obesity rate rankings. But here we also see this little movable GIF of the London Underground tube station, where you don't actually need to have the exact physical representation of how the train line goes. You just need to know where it generally goes, which line it's on, and how to get there. So really important things where you can kind of use abstraction to help you tell the story that you want to with your data. And that gets us into cartograms, which I believe Kelly might talk about later, but thinking about how we can adjust the geographic representation of things like maps to highlight the more important data, if the data is the thing we're really focused on. So in the top left, we have population. So the grid overlying the map kind of it shrinks land where there's less population. It expands land where there's more population. And on the bottom right, we see states vaguely represented by their electoral college votes. And just as a reminder, we can do all this type of abstraction and stuff like that with non-real, non-Earth places too. So we have this idea of like a map that represents things like Fantasyland, right? Like this is the map of Middle Earth from Lord of the Rings, and it kind of shows where the path that Frodo and Sam took to destroy the One Ring, but there's no context except I understand this better when I understand that the distance that it's supposed to take is to walk from Wynwood Walls in Miami to the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. So there's abstraction here because I don't know how big Middle Earth is, but when I put it in context with this other map, I kind of do understand. So yeah, just be thinking about the types of abstraction that you're willing to use. Be thinking about the types of data that is important to highlight and the data that can be sort of abstracted and sort of suppressed while you're making your map, because you can't show the extent of Tallahassee in as much detail as you want when you have a road atlas of the entire United States. So maybe you only get Tallahassee being represented in like this little ring and yellow shading. And so there's details that are being hidden. But the point isn't to necessarily show the exact detail of where everything in Tallahassee is, like every single like Indian restaurant in Tallahassee is here. The idea is to show roads and sort of like geographic features like lakes and forests and things like that. So that's the thing that you emphasize in this type of map. All right, just a couple other things. Be careful with your data. Make sure that the data that you're presenting is accurate to the story that you're trying to tell. And I'm sure Kelly will talk about this a lot more in her session on Are You Lying with Your Map? Because it's really important to show things accurately, but also making sure that when you're reading maps, you are understanding the data that's underlying them. All right. Yeah, I think that's it. Just keep an eye on some upcoming workshops and ignore that bit.ly link down at the bottom because I just realized that it's the wrong year.